God, 60 years ago, I gave my pledge as an American to save and faithfully to defend from waste the natural resources of my country, its air, soil, and minerals, its forests. And this was back in the days when conservation was conservative. It was basically invented by duck hunters and like Teddy Roosevelt. And then a weird flip happened, and now somehow green is left, but it'll probably go back to being right again at some point. I was surprised to hear that this talk relates to books. Have some people actually seen this book? The paperback, and has a afterword that corrects. I promised in the book that I would change my opinions as the facts changed, and the facts have changed, so the afterword has some of those, and so will tonight's talk. Two concepts I want to build on. One is, part of the fun of researching this book was going back in ecology since 50 years ago, and I majored in it. And one concept that's emerged in the 90s is called ecosystem engineering. And usually it refers to when it's benign, like earthworms. Earthworms are just making the soil better for earthworms, but as Charles Darwin found, they make the soil better for all sorts of creatures, including us. Here in Canada, you have a famous ecosystem engineer with the beaver, and they are making the river pond it up, make it better for beavers, but you get a big jump in biodiversity that goes to beaver dams. In fact, Scotland is finally reintroducing the beaver after it having been gone for 300 or 400 years, and they expect the Highlands of Scotland to get a huge jump in biodiversity thanks to this engineer. The other concept is infrastructure. Cities, universities, roads, highways, spectrum. Humans build infrastructure. We are building that infrastructure thanks to existing infrastructure, such as rivers. The bridge is infrastructure, and so is the river under it. So is the woods. So is the climate. We only get to have a civilization, it seems, based on the last 10,000 years, if we've got a relatively stable and recognizable climate. Third realization. History at any given period is typically driven by the 10 largest cities or so of that period. At one time, it was places like London, Paris, New York, Moscow. Tokyo got into the game pretty early. But according to the United Nations, by 2015, this will be the 10 largest cities in the world. Mumbai, Lagos, Dhaka, Sao Paulo. Why does this look familiar? Basically, we're back to normal. This is the way the world was urban 1,000 years ago. It was scattered all over. In other words, the rise of the West, as it's been called by historians, was a great 1,000 years, and it's over. Europe's influence is just part of the game now. The demographics is that 5 out of 6 of us live in the developing world, the urbanizing world, the rapidly urbanizing world. Such that this is a typical diagram now of the tipping point that we've just crossed. We think it's a tipping point. The world is now more than half urban. If we had a vote of everybody in the world about something or other, it would be dominated by city dwellers. And rural keeps going down. It's expected it'll be down to about 20% by mid-century. Rural, the rest urban. I don't think the diagram is actually going to go the way it was drawn there. I think because people are moving to cities, birth rate goes down very rapidly. As soon as women get in town, they get liberated by being in town. They have much more choice about how many children they have and how educated they'll be. And they go to replacement rate at 2.1 children per woman or less, mostly less. And meanwhile, the rural will keep going down. A book I recommend highly just came out this year after my book, by Fred Pierce, who's a science writer and New Scientist, The Coming Population Crash. The British title is People Quake, because it also has a lot to very fascinating stuff to say about migration, for example. Worked with Paul at the UN Conference on the Human Environment and so on. And Paul's a population biologist, and he extrapolated from what animals do to what humans do, I think too much. And as it happens, basically, the rate of people having children is going down so rapidly that by the second part of the century, it will be seen as a problem. In many countries, it already is. And what happened, well, Italy and Brazil both have a replacement rate, a fertility rate, birth rate of 1.3 children per woman. In 45 years, you get half the population. Another 45 years, you get half the population. So either the birth rate comes up at some point, or we go extinct. It'll take a while, but it's something to think about. 1.3 million people new in town, some of them born there, most of them moving there every week. 70 million a year. The villages of the world, small towns of the world, are emptying out. There's no place in the world this is not happening. Not in the developed world or the developing world. By and large, that's great news because the subsistence farm that these people were just barely scratching by on, basically a poverty trap, it's growing back very, very rapidly. 55 times more rainforest, mostly tropical rainforest, not yours, 55 times more is growing back as second growth than is being cut down as primary, according to a UN study. And especially in the tropics, it grows back so fast, the animals and the species, if there's some primary around that has the full biodiversity, the second growth becomes fully biodiverse in about 20 years. To this ecologist, that's fantastic news. Thanks for moving to town, everybody. So, why are they leaving here and why are they going to town? Town is where the action is. Town is where the cash economy is. Town is where opportunity is. And when you add it all up, look at places like the favelas of Rio and Sao Paulo and everywhere else in the world. 1 billion people live in slums and squatter cities now. 1 billion more are expected. And the urban planners that have studied this at the global level said, oh, did anybody notice squatters are now the dominant builders of the urban world? And they start with flimsy shacks, but pretty soon they're building with mortar and concrete, and there's always, most of these places, you'll see a bit of rebar sticking out the top of a 4-story hand-built house where they're going to make it a 5-story hand-built house as soon as they can. What's weird to me is that I have been sort of studying the squatter cities and communities of the world for 2 years before I noticed that I live in one. In fact, I was first living in the South Toledo houseboat community in mid-'70s. This is it. Like your houseboat communities in Fraser and elsewhere, we had more nerve than money. We stole electricity from the shore with lamp cords and garden hose for water. Everybody crapped in the bay. We had a fair amount of drug trade, some murders, some amateur prostitution. And we were regarded as a blight in the landscape, and the sheriff's office came after us, the city councils came after us, wreckers at dawn, and they hired lawyers, and we hired lawyers. And like any good theater place full of artists, we did our own agit-prop resistance theater. You can see the guy with the rat face is obviously a developer. And it must have worked because, lo, these many years later, we've gentrified. This is a shot taken I took from on top of a tugboat I live on. And they're all legal. We don't crap in the bay anymore. We crap in the pipes that go in and the sewer handles that. What does this have to do with anything? Well, one of the things it has to do with is how new urbanism came to happen. We had a lot of creative people on our docks. Otis Redding came by and wrote Dock of the Bay there. Peter Calthorpe, one of the founders of New Urbanism, discovered that on our dock, I lived there, he lived there then in the 80s, that we had a community because everybody saw each other face to face on foot. He invented the idea of walkability as a major pillar of thinking about how to make cities livable, and became one of the pillars of New Urbanism, and many places imitated our dock. And we're able to charge premium prices by pretending to be a dock. Slums have been thought for a long time as a drag on the economy, people stuck in poverty. But it turned out they're not stuck in poverty. They are busy getting out of poverty as fast as they can. There's so much economic activity in the slums. I mean, think about it. This is where social capital is at its densest. In a slum neighborhood, everybody knows each other whether they want to or not. And as a result, you can have an informal economy where people quietly offer services. Of course, there's no deeds or licenses or exchange rates or any of the formal economy things going on here. It's just pure Adam Smith. And that is an underpinning for an economy such that Mumbai, which is half slums, is said to be 1/6 of the gross domestic product of India. And that's probably not counting the economic activity here, because it's off the records. This is all off the books. How do slums manage infrastructure? They steal it. And that's the way it goes for sometimes decades, sometimes just a few years. Personally, I think it's better if they get non-stolen electricity earlier than later, because in many slums you get Caracas slums, for example, 4 people a month die of electrocution trying to make the electricity move around. Infrastructure, urban-type infrastructure, is what's bringing these places like India and China and so on to life. And it turns out the way to save a village is with a good road, because there's going to be cell phones now. And that means that the people who are left in the village that are now doing cash crop agriculture on the good land that was left, not the marginal land that was subsistence, they need to know what the price of carrots is in town. They need to know what the weather is going to be for the coming week. And with cell phones, they can do it. You add grid electricity, and you've got the urban-type infrastructure that lets the rural landscape become part of the urban economy and rise in the world. Now, what goes on actually in these places? You look at a lane like this in Dharavi in Mumbai. What are all those people doing there? Everything. It's rupee by rupee, rickshaw level, but it is the full range of economic activities. And my guess is that just as Peter Calthorpe learned that walkability was pretty cool from one squatter community, urban planners could do worse than hang out with places like this and see what else makes these things amenable. Because you go inside, the shacks are terrible, but you go inside, they're clean, and people are proud. When I was in Brazil recently, working for Natura on scenarios, they said to me that the poor people in Brazil are famous for taking showers 6 times a day and presenting themselves with more carefulness than basically anybody else. You go inside the shacks, and there is the same sense of pride and quality and presentation. That's pretty interesting. These places are not only providing services for themselves, for each other, but for the entire city. So in Dharavi, for example, all of the laundry is done there. There's something like 30,000 rag pickers. Most of the recycling is done there. Cities have the quality of, here we are in Sao Paulo, at the edge of a slum called Paradise. And what's going on here? Here you have the formal economy. Here you have the informal economy. Here you have rich people enjoying the view of poor people. Looks like social injustice at its worst, and in some sense it is. But think about what the economic event here. The people living over in the interesting part of town walk to work as guards and cooks and gardeners and nannies and whatnot. Over here in the rich, boring, rich part of town where you don't see anybody, they're all inside and get some of that formal economy money, and then walk back over here and help bring this community up in the world. That's what cities do. Cities slam together cultures, language groups, religions, and as long as they don't fight, they actually feed each other some profound economic event. Another example. Here we are at a market in Bangkok, and you've got a far-reaching train coming from way out in the countryside, brushing right up physically against this local food slum market. And typical of city, this things going right against each other sets up an interesting dance, and you get the kind of things that cities do. I showed this to a bunch of urban planners last night, and they fall out of their chair. Here's a gentleman probably in his shack, probably with his child, in a shack in Daurabi. His name is Laxman Kumbi, and he told the photographer the following: for toilet purposes, we have to go outside. It's a problem. We have to go in the road. The electricity is on for 2 days, then off 2 days, or not on at all. We don't have much space for the children to play in. They use the road to play, and accidents take place again and again. I've not studied at all and am illiterate. For work, I stitch government jeans and pants. It's fine, but the workday ends late. I want to educate my kids. Until the day I die, I'll educate them. As long as I'm around, that's guaranteed. So I start out feeling sorry for this guy, and then realize this is not somebody to stand in the way of. He and his children are coming up in the world. Get used to it. And what happens at a lot of these places is the parents get together in the informal economy. A few families put up some rupees together and start a private school. They just hire some teachers for their kids. The families that don't have so much money, they'll be subsidized by the slightly less poor families. People who study these schools say in many cases, not all cases, they're better than the public schools. The kids are getting education. And that changes the world. So I think the event that needs to be borne in mind is that this demographic transition that's happening is being driven by urbanization, and cities are transformative for the individual, for the family. The family moves away from tribal controls. The family becomes preeminent in the city. And so the whole society gains. It's greener. You have fewer kids. You get to participate in globalization. And cities are famous for generating wealth. That's what they've always done. You have more cities, you have more wealth. But it's all driven by that one drive of individuals and families looking for opportunity. As long as cities are the place where they can do that, cities will grow. So the picture for the next 30 years, at least, is huge cities in the global south occupied fully by working-age people. And here in the global north, the developed world, old cities full of old people. Where do you think the action's going to be? Because basically all of these cities want to eventually be like this. What draws people to the cities, as the demographers say, is bright lights, which raises the question, what powers the bright lights? Cities rely on baseload electricity that is always on. And so far, that comes from three major sources: fossil fuels, hydro, like you have here, nuclear, and we're still waiting for a fourth. Solar and wind are great, but they're intermittent. If we get a good form of storage, they will become baseload, but until then, they're not. So in the green end, nuclear versus coal is what I think an environmentalist needs to think about. This is the way it's apportioned right now worldwide. A few years ago, 40% coal, 16% nuclear, 16 hydro. Most places, hydro is maxed out. The waste stream is what you look at as an environmentalist, I think. And so if all of your electricity for your lifetime came from nuclear, the waste would be about a Coke can's worth pretty heavy Coke can, but it's tiny compared to the amount of coal and coal waste for a lifetime. Compare it apples to apples. 1 gigawatt year of nuclear electricity takes 20 tons of fuel, 20 tons of waste. The coal, 1 gigawatt year is 2.9 million tons of coal, which converts, as always, to 8 million tons of carbon dioxide, and it goes into everybody's atmosphere and cooks us. That contrast is why I wound up flipping myself from being anti-nuclear to rather avidly pro-nuclear. And the lifetime emissions of nuclear is down there with wind and hydro and somewhat ahead of solar. The problem is not that nuclear is expensive. The problem is that coal is cheap. It really is cheap. And that's why we use it as a source of power so much. Now, environmentalists have been on the subject for a while, and getting more so, and that's great. Turning up Appalachian Mountains upside down to get this cheap coal is pretty rough on the landscape, pretty rough on the people who live there. But we are finding that wind and solar have more environmental impact than we really expected. So wind, great as it is, to get a mere 1 gigawatt of electricity, it takes about 250 square miles of wind farm. Solar. In Southern California, in the Mojave, which looks like that until you bring in the solar farms, and then it looks like that. 1 gigawatt takes about 50 square miles of bulldozed desert. That's okay in the Sahara. It's okay in mineral surface, but where you've got a living desert, a green desert, I think it's not such a hot idea. We'll do some. It's fine. It's a mix. But look, the reality is it's good that the United States has not built more than, I think, 12 new coal-fired plants since 1990. But we've got 1,493 in operation, pumping greenhouse gases into your atmosphere. The environmentalist's favorite climatologist, James Hansen, he's the guy who said we need to get down to 350 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, is avidly pro-nuclear. Most environmentalists don't know this, but I trust they're finding it out shortly. And his book, Storms of My Grandchildren, is very much worth looking at. Everybody's concerned about China burning so much coal. They've made the sunsets red here in the Pacific coast. They are, in aggregate, emitting more greenhouse gases than the United States. Congratulations. But it's way less per capita. There's a lot more people in China. But, on the other hand, their demand is rising. The demand in India is rising. And one can be glad that China has the most aggressive nuclear reactor power plant construction program in the world, by far. They're talking as much as 400 new reactors. The United States has 100 and some. This is happening all over the world, and we can rejoice that once we're building them, there's a list of them, countries that are adding reactors that already have them, and new countries that are considering putting them in. It's quite a list. Let me just go through, because this is, I'm going to give a little more, there's only one chapter in the book, nuclear, but there seems to be a lot of debate about nuclear, and I think society is sort of changing its mind, or anyway, as environmentalists, many of us are changing our mind. So I'll go into a couple of the issues about nuclear. Some of them surprised me. Chernobyl. Greenpeace continues to say that, well, we can't have any more nuclear because we'll get more Chernobyls and then we'll have all these birth defect babies. John Goffman, low dosage radiation guy, said right after Chernobyl, you can expect 500,000 premature cancer deaths from the exposure of radiation that people had from the Chernobyl release. The United Nations sent 6 different departments in a group called the UN Chernobyl Forum to that area, did the research, found no extra congenital birth defects. By the way, that didn't happen after Hiroshima and Nagasaki either. And they looked for cancers in the epidemiology. They could find no extra cancers in the Ukraine, in any of the area. There's one formula that says low dosage, undetectable cancers may be on the order of 4,000 among the 600,000 people most exposed. Some of them are really exposed. And I was surprised to see how much overstated the radiation issue is. For some reason, radiation is good in the hospital. We use it for diagnostics and we use it for treatment. But it's bad when it comes from nuclear. We get a whole lot more dosage into our bodies from going to the hospital than we did even during the height of the bomb testing. So you go to Chernobyl now. This was Chernobyl then. Go to Chernobyl now. The wolves are back. In fact, the Chernobyl area, where 100,000 people or so were moved out, is now the richest wildlife refuge in all of Europe by far. White-crowned eagle is their rare bird. They've reintroduced the bison, the European bison, Prasuski's horse. And Pripyat has emptied out and reforested, and one biologist, Robert Baker, who studied in the Red Forest for 10 years, said it's very interesting that the world's worst nuclear power plant disaster is not as destructive to wildlife populations as normal human activities, like farming and logging. So I assume that any day now we're going to have Chernobyl National Park. We'll all go there. The radiation has dropped back to background what it was before. There's a few hot spots, well marked. It won't hurt you. And you can go in and look at the wreck of the reactor and ponder it just the way we ponder Stonehenge. What the hell happened here? I think it'll be a great monument, a great national park. And the United Nations group said what Ukraine, that part of Ukraine, needs more than anything is tourists. It's their own hope. It's economically really, really depressed. Not because of radiation, but because of economics. So radiation is either your friend or your song subject. Those are nuclear power plant guys, engineers. And there's a lot of opportunity there because there's a generation that didn't go become nuclear engineers. And so the nuclear engineers now have this wide open renaissance that they get to go into, and they don't have to wait for their boss to retire because there isn't one. And so there's a youth, I talked to them recently. There's actually a meeting of the Nuclear Energy Institute, and there were the senior guys upstairs in red ties. And so I talked to them and talked about some of this stuff. And there was a kind of a stirring, and the group said, there's a bunch of the young nuclear people downstairs. Would you come and talk to them? I went down there, no ties. And a completely rowdy group, and a green set of nuclear engineers who are ready to boogie. Okay, another big issue could be a whole evening is what about weapons proliferation? It is worth saying that nuclear energy has dismantled more nuclear weapons than any other activity, by far. 10% of all electricity in the United States comes from fuel made from the warheads in the Soviet Union. In other words, the very bombs that were aimed at the cities of the United States are now being beaten into plowshares that light up those cities. And we haven't even started on the United States stockpile or lots of other stockpiles. One of the reasons there's not been so much exploration for uranium and the price of uranium has stayed low for a long time is we're using up the ore that's in these damn warheads. And one of the things that can push us towards zero nuclear weapons, please, be the fact that the damn things are actually useful as fuel, unlike almost all other weapons. That's interesting. The issue always comes up, but what about transportation? You move that radioactive spent fuel around to Yucca Mountain or wherever bad accidents are going to happen, and or somebody will steal it, bad things will occur. So the Sandia lab, who has all the fun.
It was crashed first at 60 miles per hour and then at 80 miles per hour into a 700-ton concrete wall. They had been broadsided by a 120-ton locomotive traveling at 80 miles per hour. Another physical test involved dropping containers in a 30-foot freefall onto steel-reinforced concrete, comparable to hitting a concrete slab head-on at 120 miles an hour. They'd been dropped onto a 6-inch diameter spike, and the containers had been burned in a pool of aviation fuel for 90 minutes at temperatures of more than 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The result in each case, there were no ruptures or significant damage to the used fuel containers themselves. Although dented and charred, the containers remained totally intact to protect the used fuel they would carry.
Yeah, okay, but that's in the lab. What about the real world? This stuff has traveled tens of thousands of miles in the last few decades. We forget that we're not considering nuclear. We're actually looking at 40 years of experience of living with nuclear. So this stuff has traveled all over the roads. And there were 6 accidents, derailings of trains and stuff just like this, trucks that overturned and so on. None of the stuff got loose. No bad thing occurred. So this particular threat one can not worry about. But what about terrorists? Suppose the terrorists don't just get something like a jetliner, but a good military jet and fly it into one of these places.
Plane atomized with the impact. It just disappeared into dust. Only the tips of the wings escaped total destruction.
One forgets that a plane is basically a bubble. And the 9/11 planes were bubbles running into not 4-foot concrete reinforced walls. They were bubbles running into other bubbles full of fuel. And what brought the Twin Towers down was not impact, it was fire. So go ahead and blast away at these reactor containment vessels. Nothing much is going to happen. Waste. This was the one that had me concerned. 10,000 years, oh my God. Well, yucca is no longer a consideration, thank goodness. And, it's okay, but it's not as good as... The reality is where the waste is here in Canada and the United States is out back of the parking lot. And these dry cask storage, cooling off. You can go stand in front of them, be photographed, nothing bad happens. And while we decide what to do with them, they're fine there for a century or two. We may decide to bury them, or we more likely will decide to either reprocess what's in there or use it as direct fuel in 4th-generation reactors. We'll talk about in a minute. Occasionally, anti-nuclear people say, well, this is an unsolvable problem. Nobody in the world has actually successfully geologically buried nuclear waste, except that for 10 years we have in New Mexico at the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant, where you go half a mile down into this salt formation. Looks like that. And that's a 250-mile salt formation, the Salado Formation. It has been there for 250 million years. It's not going anywhere. Water doesn't get into it or out of it. And any future maniac that wants to dig down half a mile into a random salt formation in hopes of finding something valuable is so big a fool they should get irradiated. But who gives a damn? And by then it may be valuable, who knows? And part of what President Obama did when he shut down Yucca Mountain is set up a Blue Ribbon Commission to figure out the whole nuclear cycle, because he wants to go ahead with the nuclear renaissance in the United States. Remember, he comes from a state as a politician, Illinois, where I grew up, that we get more than 50% of our electricity from nuclear in Illinois. It's no big deal to him. So one of the things the Blue Ribbon Commission is looking at a new technology that emerged from the oil and gas industry called deep borehole, where you can go down 3 miles. And when you get down there, you're down in what's called basement rock, where there's saline water that never gets to the surface. It's heavy. Things move very slowly down there. And you could heave the spent fuel rods down there, mile deep, pour in some concrete, and forget about the whole thing. You don't even have to transport. You can do it out back of the parking lot where the dry cask storage is. But probably we won't do that. Something else that's new and that has somewhat changed the game is these small reactors. The big ones like from Areva and Westinghouse tend to be 1.2, 1.6 gigawatts, billion watts. These little guys, this is a 25 million watt, 25 megawatt thing from Super Safe, Small and Simple from Toshiba. These things are not built on site like the normal reactors we have now, including CANDU. They're manufactured in factories like sausage, shipped to the site on trucks or trains or barges or whatever, rotated 90 degrees, sunk in the ground. That's the containment vessel. And they tend to be pretty simple. As you may know, the ice is melting north of Russia. The Northern Sea Passage is opening up. They're planning a bunch of ports up there, pouring concrete now for those ports. How are they going to power those ports? They're making barge-mounted reactors right now that they plan to take there and also sell to the developing world for coastal countries. Here's a design for a small modular reactor from Lawrence Livermore Lab. Another one that grew out of Los Alamos Lab, 25 megawatts. One just south of you in Oregon, new scale, looking like a strong contender. A brand new player since my book, Babcock and Wilcox, doing a 125 megawatt M-Power thing. These guys are interesting because they've been building the reactors for the U.S. Navy for the last 50 years. And there's so much confidence in what they're doing that they were joined by Bechtel, who said, you design them, we'll put them on site. I mentioned fourth generation reactors, the integral fast reactors. One design, it's just a design at this point, is small, 100 megawatts. And this has the advantage of burning nuclear waste. Down in Seattle, Lowell Wood, working with Nathan Myhrvold and others, has come up with a thorium design that basically you build it, you plant it in the ground, you use the fuel for 60 years, and what's left you just leave there. It's not very potent or powerful or interesting. And if you want another 60 years worth, get another one, stick it in the ground next to it. Bill Gates lately has gone public with desire to have zero greenhouse gases coming out of our energy. He wants clean, cheap energy all over the world. That's the best thing we can do for our civilization, he figures. And one of the things he's supporting is a new design called a traveling wave reactor. That one's pretty early along. The integral fast reactors, a lot of people are developing them. China is doing it, India is doing it, Japan is doing it, and the United States was doing it until 1994 when Bill Clinton shut down our integral fast reactor research. That is now probably getting reversed. Secretary Chu, Energy Secretary, wants to have our integral fast reactor designs set back in motion again. What you can do with that, if you take a reactor site like Diablo Canyon in California, it's on the coast. With an integral fast reactor, they run hot enough that not only you get electricity, you can generate hydrogen very easily, you can desalinate water very easily, you're using your fuel and recycling it, and you're still getting a lot of very clean baseload power. Something I left out of the book because I thought the joke was right was fusion. Fusion has always seemed too good to be possible. And fusion, as we know, is 40 years in the future and always will be. And then I went to Lawrence Livermore Lab, where there's this thing called the National Ignition Facility that is working on a laser inertial fusion engine. Right now, it's just a prototype to see if they can get ignition, if they can get a net output of more energy from doing a piece of fusion than goes into it. And they're working with a tiny little target, a bit of hydrogen, of deuterium, the size of a peppercorn, inside of a chamber, about the size of this room, only spherical. And most of the action happens inside that tiny little event, and I'll show you how it goes. What you're going to do is multiply the laser energy 1,000,000 billion times in 5 millionths of a second. The amplifiers are fired up, the supercapacitors, and the oscillator room generates the coherent pulses of light. That pulse then divides into 48 preamplifiers in the laser bays. And you get a slug of light 20 feet long, 1 nanosecond long. It bounces back and forth 4 times through the main amplifier. The 48 beams are divided into 192 beams and head to the switch yard. There's the switch yard, where they are arranged to arrive simultaneously in a perfect spherical configuration at the target chamber. At the last moment, they're converted to ultraviolet light and focused to a point. At the focus, you get 500 trillion watts for 20 billionths of a second. That creates an X-ray oven at 200 million degrees Fahrenheit. It implodes the targeted deuterium, and you get ignition with a release of energy 10 to 100 times what you put in. The preliminary shots indicate that they may get ignition within the next 12 months. That would be a proof of concept that this form of fusion can actually work, way ahead of the 40 years that we keep expecting. Now, can this be an engine? Remains to be seen. But the expectation is if you can get that form of ignition 10 times a second, which is about the speed your car runs at when it's just sitting and idling, you can get a 1 gigawatt extremely clean baseload energy source with 0 greenhouse gases, 0 waste stream, 0 meltdown, 0 weaponization. That's pretty interesting. Whether it really happens, we'll know if this ignition is going to happen. I think 2 years go by and we still don't get ignition. This form of fusion may not going to pay off. But the people who really know this field well think the ignition is a given, then it's a question of engineering to make an engine that works. Well, that could change the game in a big way. We'll see. Bear in mind, just like solar, just like wind, just like fission, this stuff is more expensive than coal, probably, at least until you get way down the learning curve. So in the meantime, if 4 major government areas, European Union, North America, US and Canada, China and India, do the right thing and make coal, fossil fuels, basically, some form of expensive by taxation or cap and trade or whatever the hell. Force it to be clean. If you can burn your coal clean, you can have it. That kind of regulation by governments at that scale can change the climate picture in the long run. And so that's why suddenly the kind of libertarian thing that we did with the Whole Earth Catalog is now looking very government-oriented with this book. Yeah, the governments have to do the right thing, and we, the people, have to require them to do so. Another subject that's fun that Greens have, I think, taken the wrong side on is transgenic crops, GMOs. And I think we made the mistake of imagining that there's something unnatural about lateral horizontal gene transfer between species. It's been going on for 3.8 billion years and goes on every hour right now in your own body in microbes. They are swapping genes horizontally all the time. Genes move naturally between species, so-called higher species, all the time. To step up to that and do engineering with it is not that unnatural thing if you know the biology. So I got 2 chapters of the biology that makes biotech be as non-threatening as it is. But so you have to ask yourself, if this is so fearful, who actually likes genetically engineered food crops? Well, the Amish love BT corn. They decided it does no harm to the community and it's a way better seed, so they were one of the early adopters. In South Africa, people love white maize. It's been engineered to be better, BT corn, for 10 years now. Everybody's eating it. No harm has been caused. It's funny because in the U.S. we only do feed corn that way. Sweet corn still has worms in it because if you get organic corn, it has a worm in it. It always does. Break the cob open, or there it is. Hello. Farmers, a lot of environmentalists keep going, oh, those poor farmers are being enslaved by these seed companies. Never try to enslave a farmer. It's like you're a fisherman. It's like trying to enslave a fisherman. It's not going to happen. So if farmers are buying the seed and planting it, it's because they're finding it really good. And it is the most successful agricultural innovation probably in history. It's taking off. It's not just a question of being good for the farmers because they're having to put less of their time and money into dealing with weeds or dealing with pests. 40% of crops are lost yearly in the world to pests and crops. It's a big deal. If it's your farm and you got something that is going to be less a problem with those things, that's great. But there's another issue. The global south grows plants that have not been as highly bred and artificially evolved, artificially selected as corn and maize and so on. Rice, for example, feeds half the world, but it doesn't have the precursors for vitamin A, and so every year millions of kids go blind if they're living primarily on rice because they're not getting that set of vitamins. You need leafy vegetables or you need rice that has it in it. So a Swiss engineer came along and said, well, I bet I could engineer precursors for vitamin A into the rice. He did. It's called golden rice. It was fought tooth and nail by Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth in Europe especially. And so the introduction of this life-saving food was delayed for a decade or more by my fellow environmentalists. I think it is inexcusable. We should be eating this golden rice, and we will. It is now in field trials in the Philippines, and hopefully will be released throughout Asia within a year or so. But it could have been out there 10 years ago. Same thing has happened in Africa with a whole bunch of crops there. And there's a very good book on it called Starve for Science by Robert Paulbrod. There is an ethical issue here. It was looked at by the Newfield Council on Bioethics, not once but twice. And they came to the conclusion that the moral imperative is that GM food crops be made available, economically available, to everybody in the world that wants it. Here there's a lot of things coming. Bio-cassava plus, it doesn't have cyanide in it. That would be nice to have your cassavas not have cyanide in them. They do have the vitamins A, E, iron, zinc, etc. Sorghum, what are these numbers we're talking about? Cassava is a staple for 800 million people. Sorghum, drought tolerant, great, 500 million people. Countries like Uganda, bananas are the staple crop. Greenpeace in Africa is fighting those crops to this day, proudly. And I'm sorry, that's a mistake. But what's going to happen is these biofortified, they call them functional foods, are coming to us pretty soon. Carrots, so you don't get osteoporosis if you can't have dairy products. You like a resveratrol in your wine to make you live long like a Frenchman. You can get 6 times as much from a Chinese wine now. Some people are allergic to peanuts. There's an engineered peanut coming out of the University of Georgia. There's an non-allergenic. There it is. And so on down the line. The pig with omega-3 fatty acids is, people eat fish, kill wild fish, in order to get omega-3 fatty acids, which are good for your brain and your heart. And what if you could get it from bacon? That sounds fine to me. So there's a lot of that coming on. There's a phase shift going on between recombinant DNA technology, which is genetic engineering food crops. That's really kind of a sleepy backwater of biotech these days. What's taking off is synthetic biology. It belongs to the young. So biobricks. Basically, you can get through the mail the elements to make organisms with now. And kids are signing up for it. Student groups all over the world compete annually in September at the International Genetically Engineered Machine Jamboree at MIT. And they are coming up with novel organisms that do funny things, microbes that, one that won a prize this year was a set of bacteria that can be used as a biosensor to detect the degree of pollution in creeks. Another one was a set of microbes that could do the wave. And so on down the line. And so a lot of this stuff will be frivolous. Garden shed biotech is coming. Right now, for example, breeders of roses have been trying for centuries to get a blue rose. You can't do it. But Suntory in Japan, using a little bit of engineering, where'd they get their... They got some pansies and petunias. Put a couple of those genes in there, you got a blue rose. It is a rose and it is blue. For $30 a stem, it's yours. So people would say, oh my gosh, this is worrisome technology. Pretty soon you're going to have garage biotech. Well, never mind pretty soon, it already exists. And this is becoming an open source domain. It's becoming a domain of young people who want to do wild and crazy things with technology, just the way we did with coding for computers. I was an organizer of the Hackers Conference in 1983. And guess what? The biohackers are coming among us, and they will liberate this technology just the way we did computers. Biosecurity people are well aware of what's going on and deciding to blend in rather than try to resist. This technology is loose in the world, and it belongs to the young generation. Now, as an environmentalist, one of the things I'm most concerned about is alien invasive species. Let's go through the usual litany: the Guam brown snake, the kudzu, French broom, Spartina, feral lilies, red-reported fire ant, zebra mussels, northern snakehead, cane toad, and the good old lamprey eel. You can have all of the volunteers in the world and you can't get rid of these damn things. They do considerable harm, but you can get them with biocontrols. And biocontrols work best when they're very small and highly targeted. Typically, most biocontrols now is done with insects and sometimes the microbes. Once you can engineer these guys to go straight at the cane toad, in fact, this is being done. There's a Rana virus being developed in Australia. You can kill them with a cricket bat, but when you do, the poison sprays in your mouth. And so you're better off probably with this Rana virus that's being developed. And remember, this was an attempt to do biocontrol that got a little out of hand. And so we can undo that mistake. We're trying to undo a lot of mistakes. We're using technology to undo previous technology mistakes. But that's what it's going to take. We can't just do it by stopping where we are or withholding technology somehow. So back to ecosystem engineering. One that inspired a lot of us is Aldo Leopold, land ethic. He got a 150-acre frapped-out farm in Wisconsin, started doing his own restoration there, and inspired generations to do serious restoration ecology. Well, he undid damage on 150 acres and inspired thousands and thousands of square miles of undoing of damage. But now we're having to step up to undoing the damage to the climate. Planet scale. And that's going to get hairy because here's the picture. Civilization, been around for 10,000 years. The long summer of stable climate has apparently been what partly made that possible and what we got sort of lackadaisical about being comfortable with. But things are getting out of hand lately, and that leads to two scenarios. Business as usual. One scenario that James Lovelock, the hypothesis guy, says is it can go up 5 degrees Celsius and stabilize there. It's happened 55 million years ago. It's one of the things that Gaia does. The problem with that is you lose the rainforest, the tropics, and you've got carrying capacity for maybe 1 billion, 1.5 billion people. You're getting from, by 6 or 7 or 8 billion people down to 1, you can imagine will not be pretty. So what we would like to do, and this is the program, is to do what is necessary to keep the climate recognizable. the way it's been for the last 10,000 years. And if we do that, then we get to have a civilization that is recognizable for another 10,000 years or so. But we're dealing with a severely nonlinear system. It's pretty gnarly. There's tipping points and runaway positive feedbacks and hidden thresholds all through this system. This is just some that climatologists use to help people think about it. And even when we get little changes by like somewhat prolonged droughts, like in Darfur, droughts in the past have killed civilizations and in the present lead to warfare. When rivers dry up, from the glaciers, say, of Bhutan and the Tibetan Plateau, the rivers that come out of those glaciers, out of those snowy high grounds, this is sometimes referred to as the third pole because of its ice, those rivers, the Indus, the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, the Mekong, the Irrawaddy, the Yangtze, and the Yellow River, most of them go through multiple nations, especially in Mekong and Indus. And when people upstream try to dam and keep the water, people downstream are not going to be happy about that. So this is a potential source of warfare. I don't want to paint a completely bleak picture. There are things going on in the climate landscape that look kind of promising. Here's a organism, microorganism you can see from space called Emiliana huxleyi, E-hux to its friends, and doesn't mind acidity. That's interesting. May even prosper in it, according to some lab results. It brightens the ocean wherever it grows in these big blooms. It's a coccolithophore, which means that it fixes carbon in its shell, which other creatures don't want to eat. So when it fixes that carbon, then it dies. That shell goes down the deep ocean, and that carbon is sequestered for probably thousands of years. And, oh, by the way, it also emits dimethyl sulfide particles, which then form water droplets, which then form clouds, which also brighten the reflectance of the whole Earth. So this is a pretty promising organism. I would say give it a hand. We may need to give climate a hand sooner than we expect. One of the things which is occurring, I was just in a meeting in Washington last week about geoengineering, climate engineering, because politicians are catching on to what the scientists have been catching on to increasingly, which is that we are not going to mitigate our greenhouse gases fast enough to get ahead of the situation as it now is. And we may need to buy time by intervening directly in the climate. And one aspect is that geoengineering is surprisingly cheap. One reason we know this is because one time it was free. In 1991, Mount Pinatubo blew up and sent 20 million tons of sulfur dioxide, volcanic ash into the stratosphere. It cooled all the whole world by 0.5 degrees Celsius. James Hansen predicted it would play out that way, and his model also suggested that if you had one Pinatubo every year, you would cool the planet by 3 degrees Celsius. In other words, you would stay ahead of a doubling of the CO2. You still have enormous problems. You have acidification of the ocean. You probably have changes in rain patterns, maybe in the monsoon. This is not a solution, but it does help you buy time. So people are starting to look at, well, what would a practical form of doing Mount Pinatubo without blowing things up? And Intellectual Ventures ran the numbers on a thing they call stratoshield, and 30 blimp-supported hoses doing 100 tons a year of sulfur dioxide or maybe some metal might cost $300 million a year to cool down the planet by 3 degrees Celsius. Now the diplomats say, wait a minute, you mean any rich guy can change the climate of the whole world? Whose permission does he or she have to ask for that? So the whole governance structure of dealing with geoengineering is yet to take shape. There is no group with the United Nations, for example, that is set up to do this. So that's one of the reasons that we're talking about all these things in Washington. I'm involved with these guys, and they haven't got any government money yet. It's all retired Silicon Valley engineers. Their money, a lot of science to be done there. One that everybody likes is good old biochar. The Amazon Indians did it 4,000 years ago and turned crappy tropical rainforest soil into delicious soil that's good for agriculture. And they did it just by smoldering the plant waste or some of the forest that they cut down instead of burning it. and that turns into charcoal. Charcoal is an extremely stable molecule. Put it in the soil, makes the soil better, and it stays there for thousands of years. So people like Tim Flannery and others are saying, let's just do a whole lot of biochar with part of our agricultural apparatus and fix a lot of carbon that way. That would be good. Science still needs to be done. So the general picture has been described by Paul Crutzen as we are now we've had 10,000 years of what's called the Holocene, but the era we're in now is human-dominated, the Anthropocene. We are now stewards of the planet, whether we like it or not. We are terraforming Earth and have been for 10,000 years, actually. And we're finding out that we've been terraforming it not very well. We do not have a choice anymore of not terraforming it. We only have the choice of terraforming it better. And so the first words of this book, Whole Earth Discipline, is a reprise on Whole Earth Catalog. We are as gods, only now we have to get good at it. And the last words of the book go like this. Ecological balance is too important for sentiment. It requires science. The health of natural infrastructure is too compromised for passivity. It requires engineering. What we call natural and what we call human are inseparable. We live one life. Thank you very much.